Conscious Force from the book The Life Divine, written by Sri Aurobindo way back in 1914. The conscious force. They beheld the self-force of the divine being deep hidden by its own conscious modes of working. Swatara Upanishad. This is he that is awake in those who sleep. Katha Upanishad. All phenomenal existence resolves itself into force, into a movement of energy that assumes more or less material, more or less gross or subtle form for self-presentation to its own experience. In the ancient images by which human thought attempted to make this origin and law of being intelligible and real to itself, this infinite existence of force was figured as a sea initially at rest and therefore free from forms, but the first disturbance, the first initiation of movement necessitates the creation of forms and is the seat of a universe. Matter is the presentation of form which is most easily intelligible to our intelligence, molded as it is by contacts in matter to which a mind involved in material brain gives the response. The elementary state of material force is, in the view of the old Indian physicists, a condition of pure material extension in space of which the peculiar property is vibration, typified to us by the phenomenon of sound. But vibration in this state is ether, is not sufficient to create form. There must first be some obstruction in the flow of the force ocean, some contraction and expansion, some interplay of vibration, some impinging of the force upon force so as to create a beginning of fixed relations and mutual effects. Material force modifying its first ethereal status assume a second call in the old language of the aerial, of which the special property is contact between force and force, contact that is basis of all material relations. Still we do not as yet real form but only varying forces. A sustaining principle is needed, that is provided by a third self-modification of the primitive force of which the principle of light, electricity, fire and heat is for us the characteristic manifestation. Even then, we can have forms of force preserving their own character and peculiar action, but not stable forms of matter. A fourth state characterized by diffusion and a first medium of permanent attraction and repulsions, termed pictures quickly water or okay, let me repeat again. Still we have not as yet real form but only varying forces. A sustaining principle is needed. This is provided by a third self-modification of the primitive force of which the principle of light, electricity, fire and heat is for us the characteristic manifestation. Even then we can have forms of force preserving their own character and peculiar action, but not stable forms of matter. A fourth state characterized by diffusion and a first medium of permanent attractions and repulsions, termed picture water or the liquid state, and a fifth of cohesion term earth or the solid state, complete the necessary elements. All forms of matter of which we are aware, all physical things, even to the most subtle, are built up by the combination of these five elements. Upon them also depend all our sensible experience, for by reception of vibration comes the sense of sound, by contact of things in world of vibration of force the sense of touch, by action of light in the forms hatch outlines sustained by the force of light and fire and heat the sense of sight, by the fourth element the sense of taste, by the fifth the sense of smell. All is essentially response to vibratory contacts between force and force. In this way, the ancient thinkers bridged the gulf between pure force and its final modifications and satisfied the difficulty which prevents the ordinary human mind from understanding how all these forms, which are to his senses are real, solid, and durable, can be in truth only temporary phenomenon, and things like pure energy, to the senses non-existent, intangible, and almost incredible, can be the one permanent cosmic reality. The problem of consciousness is not solved by this theory, for it does not explain how the contact of vibrations of force should rise to conscious sensations. The Sankhyas or analytic thinkers posited therefore behind these five elements two principles which they call Mahat and Ahankara, principles that are really non-material. For the first is nothing but the vast cosmic principle of force, and the other divisional principle of ego formation. Nevertheless, these two principles are also principle of intelligence, become active in consciousness not by virtue of force itself, but by virtue of an inactive conscious soul or souls in which its activities are reflected, and by that reflection assume the hue of consciousness. Such is the explanation of things offered by the school of Indian philosophy which comes nearest to the modern materialistic ideas and which carries the idea of a mechanical or unconscious force in nature as far as was possible to a seriously reflective Indian mind. Whatever its defect, its main idea was so indisputable that it came to be generally accepted. However, the phenomenon of consciousness may be explained whether nature be an inert impulse or a conscious principle. It is certainly force. The principle of things is the formative movement of energies. All forms are born of meeting and mutual adaptation between unshaped forces. All sensation and action is a response of something in the form of force to the contacts of other form of force. This is the world as we experience it, and from this experience we must always start. Physical analysis of matter by modern science have come to the same general conclusion, even if a last few doubts still linger. Intuition and experience confirm the concord of science and philosophy. Pure reason finds in it the satisfaction of its own essential conceptions. For even in the view of the world as essentially an act of consciousness, an act is implied, and in the act moment of force play of energy. This also, when we examine from within our own experience, proves to be the fundamental nature of the world. All our activities are the play of triple force of the old philosophies: knowledge force, desire force, action force, and all this proves to be really three streams of original and identical power, Adya Sakti. Even our states of rest are only equable state of equilibrium of the play of a moment, play of her movement of force being admitted as the whole nature of the cosmos. Two questions arise. But first, how did the movement come to take place at all in the bosom of existence? If we suppose it to be not only eternal but the very essence of all existence, the question does not arise. But we have negative this theory. We are aware of an existence which is not compelled by the movement. But then, does this movement, alien to its eternal repose, come to take place in it? By what cause? By what possibility? By what mysterious impulsion? The answer most approved by the ancient Indian mind was that the force is inherent in existence. Shiva and Kali, Brahman and Shakti are one and not two who are separable. Force inherent in existence may be at rest or it may be in motion, but when it is at rest, it exists nonetheless and is not abolished, diminished, or in any way essentially altered. This reply is so entirely rational and in accordance with the nature of things that we need not hesitate to accept it, for it is impossible, because contradictory of reason, to suppose that force is a thing alien to one and infinite existence and entered into it from outside, or was non existent and arose in it at some point in time. Even the illusionist theory must admit that Maya, the power of self illusion, is Brahman, is potentially eternal in eternal being. And then the sole question in its manifestation or non manifestation, the Sankhya, also asserts the eternal coexistence of Prakriti and Purusha, nature and conscious soul, and the alternative states of rest or equilibrium of Prakriti and movement or disturbance of equilibrium. But since force is thus inherent in existence, and it is the nature of force to have this double or alternative potentiality of rest and movement, that is to say, of self concentration in force and self diffusion in force, the question of how the movement, its possibility, initiating impulsion or impelling cause, does not arise, for we can easily then conceive that this potentiality must translate itself either as an alternative rhythm of rest and movement succeeding each other in time, or else as an eternal self concentration of force in immutable existence, with a superficial play of movement, change, and formation like the rising and falling of waves on the surface of the ocean. And this superficial play, we are necessarily speaking in inadequate images, may be either co-eval with the self-concentration and itself also eternal, or it may begin and end in time and be resumed by a sort of constant rhythm. It is then not eternal in continuity but eternal in recurrence. The problem of how thus eliminated, there present itself the question of the why. Why should this possibly Why should this possibility of a play of movement of force translate itself at all? Why should not force of existence remain eternally concentrated in itself, infinite, free from all variation and formation? This question also does not arise if we assume existence to be non conscious and consciousness only a development of material energy which we wrongly suppose to be immaterial. For then we can say simply that this rhythm is the nature of force in existence, and there is absolutely no reason to seek for a why, a cause, an initial motive, or a final purpose of for that which is in its nature eternally self existent. We cannot put that question to eternal self existence and ask it either why it exists or how it came into existence. Neither can we put it to self force of existence and its inherent nature of impulsion to movement. All that we can then inquire into is its nature of self manifestation, its principle of movement and formation, its process of evolution, both existence and force being inert status, and inert impulsion. Both of them unconscious and unintelligent, there cannot be any purpose or final goal in evolution or any original cause or intention. But if we suppose or find existence to be conscious beings, the problem arises. We may indeed suppose a conscious being which is subject to its nature of force, compelled by it, and without option as to whether it shall manifest in the universe or remain unmanifest. Such is the cosmic god of the Tantrics and the Mahavadins who are subject to Shakti or Maya. Purusha involved in Maya or controlled by Shakti, but it is obvious that such a god is not the supreme infinite existence with which we have started. Admittedly, it is only a formulation of Brahman in the cosmos by the Brahman, which is itself logically anterior to Shakti or Maya and takes her back into its transcendental being when she ceases from her work in a conscious existence which is absolute, independent of its formation, not determined by its work. We must suppose an inherent freedom to manifest or not to manifest the potentiality of movement. A Brahman compelled by Prakriti is not Brahman but an inert infinite with an active content in it more powerful than the continent, a conscious holder of the force of whom his force is master. If we say that it is compelled by itself as forced by its own nature, we do not get rid of the contradiction, the evasion of our first postulate. We have got back to an existence which is really nothing but force, force at rest or in movement, absolute force perhaps, but not absolute being. It is then necessary to examine into relation between force and consciousness. But what do we mean by the latter term? Ordinarily, we mean by it our first obvious idea of a mental waking consciousness, such as is possessed by the human being during the major part of the bodily existence, when he is not asleep, stunned, or otherwise deprived of his physical and superficial method of sensation. In this sense, it is plain enough that consciousness is the exception and not the rule in the order of the material universe. We ourselves do not always possess it, but this vulgar and shallow idea of the nature of consciousness, though it still colors our ordinary thought and association, must now definitely disappear out of philosophical thinking, for we know that there is something in us which is conscious when we sleep, when we are stunned or drugged, or in a swoon, in all apparently unconscious state of our physical being. Not only so, but we may now be sure that the old thinkers were right when they declared that even in our waking state, what we call our consciousness is only a small selection from our entire conscious being. It is a superficies, it is not even the whole of our mentality. Behind it, such vastness, then it there is a subliminal or subconscious mind which is the greater part of ourself and contain heights and profundities which no man has yet measured or fathomed. This knowledge gives us a starting point for the true science of force and its working. It delivers um, okay, let me repeat this again. Behind it must faster than it there is a subliminal or subconscious mind which is the greater part of ourselves and contain heights and profundities which is no man has yet measured or fathomed. This knowledge gives us a starting point for the true science of force and its workings. It delivers us definitely from circumscription by the material and from the illusion of the obvious. Materialism indeed insists that whatever the extension of consciousness, it is a material phenomenon inseparable from our physical organs and not their utilizer but their result. This orthodox contention, however, is no longer able to hold the field against the tide of increasing knowledge. Its explanations are becoming more and more inadequate and strained. It is becoming always clearer that not only does the capacity of our total consciousness far exceed that of our organs, the senses, the nerves, the brain, and that even for our ordinary thought and consciousness, these organs are only their habitual instruments and not their generators. Consciousness uses the brain which its upward strivings have produced. Brain has not produced nor does it use consciousness. There are even abnormal instances which go to prove that our organs are not entirely indispensable instruments, that the heartbeats are not absolutely essential to life, any more than is breathing, nor the organized brain cells to thought our physical organism no more causes or explain thought and consciousness than the construction of an engine causes or explain the motive power of steam or electricity. The force is anterior, not the physical instrument. Momentous logical consequences follow. In the first place, we may ask whether, since even mental consciousness exists when we see inanimation and inertia, it is not possible that even in material objects, a universe subconscient mind is present, although unable to act or communicate itself to its surface for want of organs. Is the material state an emptiness of consciousness, or is it not rather only a sleep of consciousness? Even though from the point of view of evolution an original and not an intermediate sleep. And by sleep, the human example teaches us that we mean not a suspension of consciousness, but its gathering inward away from conscious physical response to the impacts of external things. And is not this what all existence is that has not yet developed means of outward communication with the external physical world? Is there not a conscious soul, a Purusha, which wakes for even even in all that sleeps? We may go further. When we speak of subconscious mind, we should mean by the phrase a thing not separate from the outer mentality, but also acting below the surface, unknown to the waking man, in the same sense, if perhaps with a deeper plunge and a larger scope. but phenomena of the subliminal self far exceeds the limit of any such definition. It includes an action not only immensely superior in capacity but quite different in kind from what we know as mentality in our waking self. We have therefore a right to suppose that there is superconscient in us as well as subconscient, a range of conscious faculties and therefore an organization of consciousness which rise high above the psychological stratum to which we give the name of mentality. And since the subliminal self in us thus rises in superconscience above mentality, may it not also sink in subconscious below mentality? Are there not in us and in the world forms of consciousness which are submental to which we can give the name of vital and physical consciousness? If so, we must suppose in the plant and the metal only a force to which we can give the name of consciousness, although it is not the human and animal mentality for which we have hitherto preserved the monopoly of that description. Not only is that probable, but if we will consider things dispassionately, it is certain in ourselves there is such a vital consciousness which acts in the cells of the body and the automatic vital functions so that we go through purposeful movements and obey attractions and repulsions to which our mind is a stranger. In animals, this vital consciousness is an even more important factor. In plants, it is intuitively evident. The seekings and shrinkings of the plant, its pleasure and pain, its sleep and its wakefulness, and all the strange life whose truth an Indian scientist has brought to light by rigidly scientific methods are all movements of consciousness, but as far as we can see, not of mentality. There is then submental, a vital consciousness which has precisely the same initial reaction as the mental but is different in the constitution of self experience, even as that which is superconscient is in the constitution of this self experience different from the mental being. Thus, the range of what we call consciousness sees with the plant, with that in which we recognize the existence of sub-animal plant. If so, we must then suppose that there is a force of life and consciousness originally alien to matter which has yet entered into and occupied matter, perhaps from another world, for whence otherwise can it have come. The ancient thinker believed in the existence of such other world which perhaps sustain life and consciousness in ours or even call it out by their pressure but do not create it by their entry. Nothing can evolve out of matter which is not therein already contained. But there is no reason to suppose that the gamut of life and consciousness fails and stops short in that it seemed to us purely material. The development of recent research and thought seem to point to a sort of obscure beginning of life and perhaps a sort of inert or suppressed consciousness in the metal and in the earth and in other inanimate forms, or at least the first stuff of what becomes consciousness in us may be there. Only while in the plant we can dimly recognize and conceive the things that I have called vital consciousness, the consciousness of matter of the inert form is difficult indeed for us to understand or imagine, and what we find it difficult to understand or imagine, we consider it our right to deny. Nevertheless, when one has pursued consciousness so far into the depth, it becomes incredible that there should be this sudden gulf in nature. Thought has a right to suppose a unity where that unity is confessed by all other classes of phenomena, and in one class only not denied but merely more concealed than in others. And if we suppose the unity to be unbroken, we then arrive at the existence of consciousness in all forms of the force which is at work in the world. Even if there is no conscient or superconscient Purusha inhabiting all forms, yet is there in those forms a conscious force of being by which even their outer parts overtly or inertly partake. Necessarily, in such a view, the word consciousness changes its meaning. It is no longer synonymous with mentality, but indicates a self aware force of existence, of which mentality is a middle term. Below mentality, it sinks into vital and material movement, which are for us subconscient. Above, it rises into the supramental, which is for us the superconscient. But in all, it is one and the same thing organizing itself differently. This is once more the Indian conception of Chit, which as energy creates the worlds. Essentially, we arrive at that unity which materialist science perceive from the other end when it asserts that mind cannot be another force than matter but must be merely development and outcome of material energy. Indian thought at its deepest affirms, on the other hand, that mind and matter are rather different grades of the same energy, different organization of one conscious force of existence. But what right have we to assume consciousness as the just description of this force? For consciousness implies some kind of intelligence, purposefulness, self knowledge, even though they may not take the form habitual to our mentality. Even from this point of view, everything supports rather than contradicts the idea of a universal conscious force we see, for instance, in animal operations for a perfect purposefulness and an exact, indeed, a scientifically minute knowledge which are quite beyond the capacities of the animal mentality, and which man himself can only acquire by long culture and education, and even then uses with a much less sure rapidity. We are entitled to see in this general fact the proof of a conscious force at work in the animal and the insect, which is more intelligent, more purposeful, more aware of its intention, its ends, its means, its condition than the highest mentality yet manifested in any individual form on earth. And in the operations of inanimate nature, we find that the same pervading characteristics of a supreme hidden intelligence, hidden in the modes of its own workings. The only argument against a conscious and intelligent source of this purposeful work, this work of intelligence, of selection, adaptation, and seeking, is that large element in nature's operation to which we give the name of waste. But obviously, this is an objection based on the limitation of our human intellect, which seeks to impose its own particular rationality good enough for limited human ends on the general operations of world force. We see only part of nature's purpose, and all that does not serve that part we call waste. Yet even our own human action is full of an apparent waste, so appearing from the individual point of view, which yet we may be sure serves well enough the large and universal purpose of things, that part of her intention which we can detect nature gets done surely enough in spite of, perhaps really by virtue of her apparent waste. We may well trust to her in the rest which we do not yet detect. For the rest, it is impossible to ignore the drive of set purpose, the guidance of apparent blind tendency, the sure eventual or immediate coming to the target sought, which characterize the operations of world force in the animal, in the plant, in inanimate things, so long as matter was alpha and omega to the scientific mind. The reluctance to admit intelligence as the mother of intelligence was an honest scruple, but now it is no more than an outworn paradox to affirm the emergence of human consciousness, intelligence, and mastery out of an unintelligent, blindly driving unconsciousness in which no form of substance of them previously existed. Man's consciousness can be nothing else than a form of nature's consciousness. It is there in other involved forms below mind, it emerges in mind. It shall ascend in yet superior forms beyond mind, for the force that builds the worlds is a conscious force. The existence which manifests itself in them is conscious being, and a perfect emergence of its potentialities in form is the sole subject which we can rationally conceive for its manifestation of this world of forms.